The origins and construction of the aqueducts, 1,500 to 2,000 words. When you turn your thoughts to the grandeur of Rome, you likely picture triumphal arches, vast arenas, and marble statues gleaming in the sun. But beneath the surface of glory and conquest lay a quieter, slower achievement that shaped daily life more profoundly than parades or battles: the aqueducts. These monumental channels of stone and brick carried water from distant springs and rivers into Rome and its towns. Yet behind every shimmering flow of clean water stood the unseen laborers, the men who quarried the stone, dug the trenches, and hauled the materials day after day. Their lives, repetitive and uncelebrated, were the real backbone of Rome's public health and power. Let us begin, then, not with the finished marvel, but with its raw beginnings, in the dust and mud where the workers toiled. Rome's need for water. By the 4th century BCE, the Roman population had outgrown the simple wells, cisterns, and local springs that had sustained earlier villages. With tens of thousands of citizens, animals, bathhouses, and fountains to supply, water was no longer just a convenience. It was a necessity. The solution was the aqueduct, a system of channels that brought water from miles away using the simplest principle of all: gravity. The engineering was clever, but the labor was grueling. Each aqueduct demanded years of digging through hillsides, bridging valleys, and laying endless lengths of stone channel. For every moment of ingenuity by Roman engineers, there were thousands of back-breaking hours by anonymous workers who would never be remembered in marble. Recruitment of workers. Who built the aqueducts? Not patricians, nor celebrated engineers, but mostly slaves, freedmen, and poor laborers. Rome's expansion across Italy and beyond ensured a steady supply of enslaved people who were often assigned to construction gangs. Alongside them, workday laborers, peasants drawn into the city by the promise of coin when fields failed or war displaced them. The worksite was a melting pot of the empire's lowest ranks: Syrians, Gauls, Greeks, and native Italians bent side by side over picks and shovels. The engineers and surveyors, usually free Romans of middling status, gave instructions from the sidelines, but it was these nameless men who sweated under the sun. For many, joining the labor force was not a choice but a sentence, yet for others it was survival, a means to earn bread, a cloak, or a roof in the crowded tenements of Rome. Tools of the trade. Forget polished instruments or sophisticated machines. The aqueduct workers wielded the simplest tools: iron picks and hammers for breaking stone, wooden shovels reinforced with iron strips for digging clay and soil, ropes, baskets, and wicker sleds for hauling earth, crude wooden cranes and pulleys for lifting blocks into place. Every tool was heavy, prone to breaking, and awkward to use. Splinters, cuts, and constant blisters were the natural consequence of a day's work. Few workers had shoes, and those who did wore crude sandals that provided little protection. Daily grind of construction. A typical day began at dawn. Workers were herded to the site, whether a trench, a hillside cut, or the rising arches of a bridge. Overseers barked orders while whips cracked on the backs of those too slow to respond. The pace was relentless because the city demanded progress and delays meant shortages of water. Tasks varied with the terrain. In rocky hillsides, men swung picks for hours, chipping away at stone inch by inch to carve tunnels. In valleys, gangs shoveled dirt to create embankments for the channel. Where the aqueduct crossed marshes, laborers laid wooden piles, sinking them into the mud by hand with heavy mallets. When arches rose, ropes creaked under the weight of stone blocks, and workers balanced precariously on scaffolds to guide them into place. The sun beat down, dust filled their lungs, and the day ended only when light faded. Nights were spent in crude huts near the work sites, with bread, porridge, and thin wine for supper. The cycle repeated endlessly, year after year. The hidden engineering. To the workers, much of the project must have seemed endless and senseless. Yet behind their toil lay the minds of Roman engineers who calculated gradients with astonishing precision. The aqueduct's slope had to be almost imperceptible. Too steep, and water would erode the channel. Too shallow, and it would stagnate. Surveyors carried chorobates, long wooden levels with water troughs, and groma, cross-shaped sighting instruments, to plot the lines. But once their measurements were marked, it was the workers who dug, lifted, and carried until the channel stretched across the land. For the laborer hauling a basket of rubble, the engineer's vision mattered little. All he knew was the weight on his shoulders, the calluses on his palms, and the exhaustion in his legs, hazards of the work. Danger lurked everywhere. In tunnels, collapses buried men alive. In scaffolds, a single misstep meant a fall onto stone. In marshes, fever and disease spread swiftly. Even without accidents, the constant strain bent backs and shortened lives. Medical care was minimal. A cut might fester into infection. A broken limb meant dismissal or death. Overseers had little patience for the injured, and replacements were always available. The aqueducts may have been Rome's lifelines, but the workers were disposable. A worker's perspective. Imagine, for a moment, standing in their shoes. You are a young man from the countryside, your family driven off the land by debt. You come to Rome hoping for work and are assigned to an aqueduct project outside the city. Each morning you wake on straw, eat a scrap of bread, and pick up your shovel. You spend the day under a brutal overseer's eye, moving stone and dirt until your muscles ache. At night, you return to your hut, too tired to speak, too sore to move. You know this project will not end for years, and you will never be remembered when it does. The aqueduct arches will stand tall, admired by senators and poets, but your name, your sweat, your suffering will vanish into dust. This was the daily grind of Rome's aqueduct builders, anonymous, repetitive, and relentless. Rome's thirst and the workers' burden. And yet, despite the misery, their labor sustained the lifeblood of the empire. Every amphitheater fountain, every bathhouse, every noble's villa with flowing water. These luxuries rested on the backs of nameless men swinging picks in the sun. It is tempting to marvel at the genius of Roman engineering without pausing to consider the human cost. But the aqueducts were not magic. They were the product of thousands of aching hands and bent backs. The grandeur of Rome's water supply was built not by emperors, but by exhausted, often unwilling, laborers who received little thanks for their sacrifice. So we end this first look at the aqueducts where we began, in the dust and sweat of construction. The arches of stone may gleam in memory, but for the men who built them, every day was the same grind of labor. Yet what happened once the aqueducts were complete? Who kept them flowing, cleaned them, and repaired their endless cracks and leaks? Maintenance, cleaning, and the endless routine. Maintenance, cleaning, and the endless routine. 1,500 to 2,000 words. The aqueducts of Rome were not monuments frozen in time. They were living arteries, constantly in need of attention. While emperors boasted of building them and poets sang of their waters, the daily business of keeping them flowing fell on the backs of workers whose tasks were as repetitive as they were indispensable. If building the aqueducts was brutal, maintaining them was worse, because the work never ended. The fragility of great works. To the Roman citizen filling a jug at a fountain, water seemed eternal, flowing day and night. Yet aqueducts were fragile. Channels cracked. Lime incrustations narrowed the flow. Rats and snakes found their way inside. Floods eroded supports, and human hands tapped illegal pipes. Without constant care, the magnificent stream dwindled to a trickle. The responsibility for maintaining these marvels fell to a group of officials and workers overseen by the curator aquarum, the official guardian of the waters. Appointed by the emperor, this man was prestigious, but he rarely touched stone or water himself. Beneath him were slaves, freedmen, and hired laborers, the same kind of men who had built the aqueducts. They were the silent army who scraped, patched, and trudged along the channels, ensuring that Rome's thirst was never left unquenched. The tools of maintenance. Their equipment was simple but specialized. Imagine a worker's kit laid out on a rough wooden bench. Scrapers and chisels for removing lime deposits from the inner channels. Brushes made of reeds for scrubbing walls. Clay and mortar trowels for patching cracks in the stonework. Buckets and ropes for hauling out debris or waterlogged silt. Torches to light the darkness inside the conduits. The aqueducts themselves often ran underground or through tunnels cut into hills. To access them, workers squeezed into narrow inspection shafts, little more than vertical stone wells barely wide enough for a man to descend. Rope in hand, torch in mouth, the workers slid down into a stifling channel where only crawling was possible. The routine of cleaning. One of the greatest challenges was lime buildup. The mineral-rich waters of Italy left thick, chalky deposits along the stone channels. Over years, these deposits hardened into crusts that shrank the flow of water. Removing them was a never-ending task. Workers hacked at the walls with chisels, sweating in the confined darkness, the sound of each strike echoing like a drumbeat. Dust filled their lungs, torch smoke stung their eyes, and water seeped around their knees. Hours passed in suffocating monotony. When they emerged, their clothes were white with dust, their hands blistered, their backs bent. And within months, the lime would return. Debris was another problem. Floods carried mud and branches into the channels. Animals sometimes drowned inside. Workers pulled out bloated carcasses of dogs, goats, or snakes, gagging at the stench. Rome's citizens drank from these channels, but the laborers knew what floated in them before it was scooped out. The burden of leakage. Cracks were inevitable. Earthquakes, settling ground, and simple were split the mortar seams of the aqueducts. Water gushed out in waste, soaking the soil, eroding the supports. Repairing these leaks was dangerous and tedious. Workers clambered up scaffolds to smear fresh mortar into cracks. Others hauled stone blocks to reinforce arches. In marshy stretches, gangs waded waist-deep in mud, trying to plug holes with bundles of reeds and clay. Their skin grew raw from constant wetness, and fevers spread through the camps. The frustration was endless. Every repaired leak was only temporary. A worker might spend weeks patching a stretch of channel, only to return the following season to find it leaking again. Illegal taps and theft. Another burden was the ingenuity of Rome's citizens themselves. Despite strict laws, many households and even whole neighborhoods attempted to tap the aqueducts illegally. A small hole bored into a channel could divert water into a private bath or garden. Inspectors prowled the lines looking for suspicious flows. When they found an illegal pipe, workers were sent to smash it and patch the wall. Sometimes they confronted angry locals who resisted, leading to quarrels or even violence. In such cases, the laborer was not just a repairman, but a target of public resentment. The life of the conduit worker. Day after day, these men trudged miles along the aqueduct's length. Some stretches were rural, through fields and forests. Others wound through the crowded city. Wherever they went, they carried their tools, ready to descend into shafts or climb arches. Their clothing was plain, tunics stained with lime and mortar, sandals caked with mud, cloaks patched with rough stitches. They worked in all weathers. In summer, the sun scorched them as they climbed stone arches. In winter, freezing water numbed their hands. The pay, if they were free laborers, was meager, barely enough to keep a family fed. For slaves, there was no pay at all, only the daily grind under an overseer's lash. Meals were dull: bread, beans, perhaps onions, or a scrap of salted meat. Wine diluted with water offered the only relief at day's end. At night, they collapsed in crowded huts or insulae, rising at dawn to repeat the cycle. Health and hazards. The hazards of maintenance were insidious. Lime dust corroded lungs and teeth. Constant wetness led to sores, fungal infections, and fevers. Falling from scaffolds or slipping inside conduits could kill instantly. There was also the creeping psychological toll. Imagine crawling through a pitch-dark tunnel for hours, torch flickering, the air stale, the task unending. The sense of isolation, claustrophobia, and monotony weighed heavily. Many workers learned to move on instinct, hacking at walls without thinking, their minds numb. And yet, despite the dangers and drudgery, the work never ceased. Because if it did, the fountains dried up, the baths went empty, and the city complained. The aqueducts demanded not just building, but perpetual servitude, public gratitude, or lack thereof. Few Romans thought of the workers who kept the water flowing. Senators praised emperors for their generosity in providing fountains and baths. Citizens marveled at the arches striding across valleys. But the men who trudged through mud and lime remained invisible. Only occasionally do records mention them. Inscriptions sometimes list the names of overseers or engineers, never the laborers. For the common worker, anonymity was the price of Rome's comfort. We have now traced the long grind of keeping Rome's aqueducts alive, scraping lime, patching cracks, hauling carcasses, and smashing illegal pipes. It was a life of repetition, discomfort, and obscurity. But what, in the end, did this labor achieve? Did it change Rome, shape its society, and alter the fate of its people in ways that still echo today? The social impact and legacy of aqueduct labor. If the aqueduct builders and cleaners lived such hard and thankless lives, you may wonder why their toil mattered at all. To the men themselves, the work was repetitive, dirty, and often dangerous. Yet when we step back to look at the larger picture, the quiet endurance of these laborers shaped Rome in ways that reached far beyond their huts, scaffolds, or tunnels. Their unending grind was not just about water. It was about society, empire, and legacy, the gift of abundance. Rome was not unique in creating aqueducts. Greeks, Persians, and other peoples had channels and wells. What made Rome distinct was scale. By the height of the empire, Rome itself was fed by 11 aqueducts stretching hundreds of miles. Together, they delivered an estimated 200 million gallons of water per day. This abundance transformed daily life. Fountains bubbled in every district. Public baths, numbering in the hundreds, welcomed citizens to wash, socialize, and relax. The wealthy had private gardens irrigated by streams. Even the poor, crowded into insulae, had access to public taps. But behind this comfort stood the invisible army of workers who kept the channels open. Without their scraping, patching, and hauling, the flow would have dwindled to a trickle. The grandeur of Rome's daily life, the very sense that it was a city of luxury and order, depended on the unseen sweat of men covered in lime dust. Water as a tool of control. The aqueducts were more than practical, they were political. Emperors and senators understood that clean water was a symbol of prosperity and stability. By providing baths and fountains, they won the loyalty of citizens. Grain and games might keep bellies and eyes satisfied, but water touched every moment of daily existence. The laborers, unknowingly, were part of this political machinery. When they patched a crack, they preserved not only the aqueduct, but also the emperor's reputation. When they cleaned a conduit, they ensured that bathhouses could operate, where Romans gathered to discuss politics and exchange gossip. The aqueduct workers were silent guardians of Rome's social fabric, though no one ever thanked them for it. Unequal distribution. Still, not all Romans benefited equally. The elite secured private channels into their villas and gardens. Senators dined with fountains bubbling in courtyards, while the poor still carried buckets through muddy alleys. Aqueduct workers were often the first to see this inequality. Imagine a man emerging from a tunnel, lime dust in his hair, hands raw from scraping stone. He trudges past a noble's villa where water flows endlessly into ornamental pools, then returns to his own tenement where his family waits in a cramped, dry room. He repairs the leaks that supply others luxury, but he cannot guarantee a drop for his own household. This contrast must have been bitter, even if rarely voiced. Rome's greatness was built on such disparities. One man's convenience rested on another's exhaustion. A social underclass in shadows. Because aqueduct laborers were mostly slaves, freedmen, or poor migrants, their place in society was low. They did not enjoy the prestige of soldiers, the authority of officials, or the influence of merchants. Their work was essential but invisible. Slaves had no choice but to toil. Freedmen who took such jobs carried the stigma of their lowly origins. Free poor men who worked on the aqueducts did so out of necessity, often mocked by those who lived off trade or military spoils. And yet, this underclass was vast. In many ways, they were the silent majority of Rome, the faceless workforce whose hands raised arches, cut channels, and kept fountains flowing. If we think of Rome as an empire of glory, it is only fair to remember it was also an empire of labor. Cultural consequences of clean water. The impact of aqueducts extended beyond convenience. Clean, abundant water reshaped Roman habits and expectations. Public baths. Bathing became central to Roman identity. Citizens expected access to warm, flowing water, not just for cleanliness, but for leisure. Without aqueduct workers, these temples of relaxation would have fallen silent. Public health. Though Romans lacked modern germ theory, abundant water reduced reliance on stagnant wells, improving hygiene and lowering disease in cities. The laborers who scraped lime and cleared dead animals were, unknowingly, protectors of public health. Urban growth. A city of 1 million people could not survive on wells alone. Aqueducts made dense urban living possible, allowing Rome to grow into the largest metropolis of the ancient world. Every stone lifted and every crack patched made this growth sustainable. Thus, though their work was monotonous, the consequences were vast. The laborers' grind shaped not only daily life, but the very trajectory of Rome as an empire. The aqueducts as symbols of empire. For Romans, aqueducts were not merely practical. They were symbols of dominion over nature. To channel water across valleys and through mountains demonstrated Rome's mastery over land itself. Arches striding across the countryside impressed citizens and foreigners alike. But for the worker, the grandeur was hollow. Standing beneath an arch he had helped raise, he saw not a symbol of empire, but a sore back and calloused hands. He did not share in the glory carved into inscriptions. His name was not remembered. The stones bore only the names of emperors and engineers. This tension between the public symbol and the private grind was the silent story of every aqueduct, decline, and forgotten hands. In the centuries after Rome's height, the aqueducts fell into disrepair. Invading armies cut channels. Earthquakes toppled arches. Without the endless labor force, the water stopped flowing. By the early Middle Ages, many aqueducts were ruins, their stones reused for churches and houses. The workers who once trudged their length were long forgotten. No chronicler recorded their names. No monument honored their toil. Their legacy endured only indirectly, in the ruins of arches and the faint trace of channels across hillsides. Yet in those ruins lies a quiet reminder. For centuries, nameless men labored in dust and darkness, keeping Rome alive day by day. Their lives were humble, their tasks dull, but together they created one of the most enduring legacies of the ancient world. Reflection: why it sucked to be an aqueduct worker. So, why did it suck to be a Roman aqueduct worker? Not because the work was spectacular, but because it was endless, thankless, and invisible. They labored in tunnels filled with dust, carried loads through mud, patched leaks that would soon reappear, and hauled out carcasses from the water others drank. Their health broke early, their names were lost, and their labor benefited others far more than themselves. And yet, in a strange way, their suffering mattered. Rome's greatness rested not on emperors alone, but on these forgotten men. Their monotony was Rome's glory. Their exhaustion was Rome's abundance. Their invisibility was the price of Rome's splendor. Next time you picture the Roman Empire, arches, baths, fountains, marble villas, remember the man in the tunnel, scraping lime by torchlight, coughing in the dust. Without him, the empire would have dried up long before its fall.